Let me introduce myself, Donovan Phones. I've worked in San Mateo County since 2005. I worked as a psychiatric social worker, a school-based clinician at Bayshore Elementary School, which is really right up over the hill. Bayshore, it used to be Bayshore Elementary and Robertson Intermediate. Now, of course, it's one big school. I actually still supervise a staff who works there providing prevention, early intervention, mental health services. I did that for about 8 years. School-based work is really my passion. My wife is a high school English teacher. She corrects my grammar all the time. I grew up with teachers and therapists in my family, and so the idea of being in school systems and supporting teachers whose jobs are getting more and more difficult is a real passion of mine. One of the things that I've done in the last few years is I've become a trainer for Trauma Transformed. Has anyone heard of Trauma Transformed? Okay. And I heard there are a few nurses here, right? Are there? I'm wondering if anybody has attended the Trauma Transformed training before. Yes, okay. I figured there would be a couple people here. So what we're going to do today is we're not going to do a Trauma Transformed training, but what I'd like to do is give you an overview of what the Trauma Transformed sort of initiative is like, the Trauma-Informed Systems training is all about. But using the PowerPoint, working with Carla and Sudi, we sort of looked at this kind of overview of this training and tried to figure out how to make it interactive and how we could use it to bring up conversation that you guys could talk about in terms of, how to bring some of these principles into your work. You might already be doing really great things around trauma-informed principles with your organizations. And so, basically, real briefly, Trauma Transformed was a collaboration of 7 Bay Area counties that really started because of the work in San Francisco from the UCSF Hearts program, Joyce Dorado, and they wanted to make the schools in San Francisco more trauma-informed. So they developed this curriculum, and in developing this curriculum, they realized that, okay, it would be great to teach everybody about trauma, for everyone to have the common language about trauma, to understand how trauma impacts us and other people. But the reality is that trauma impacts systems as well. And so it's not just enough to do individual interventions with everyone that we think has been traumatized or deal with our own stuff with trauma. The reality is systems can become traumatized too. And so this idea is sort of understanding the basics of trauma, but also understanding how they impact our organizations and systems. And what we're hoping is you can have these conversations today and maybe come up with some ideas to advocate for change or even to keep doing great things that you're already doing. So what we want to do today is we want to develop a shared understanding of and participate in activities and discussions related to how stress and trauma affect systems and organizations, an overview of the basic neurobiology of stress and trauma. So a lot of you may be familiar with some of these concepts, but I think it's really good to kind of start from the same place of understanding. And then some of the components of the trauma-informed systems organizational change model. Okay, so we're really trying to look at stress and trauma as one of the primary public health issues. Everyone heard of the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences study, where the more sort of adverse childhood experiences, traumatic experiences, as a child and growing up, the worse the long-term health outcomes are. Heart disease, diabetes, all these sorts of, it impacts life expectancy. And so the idea is that we need to treat trauma not just as an individual thing like we talked about client by client, but really within communities. So part of the trauma-informed systems training, and again, we're not doing that whole training here, but just sort of an overview, is we're looking at how those impacts of trauma in communities kind of ripple out, how they impact our systems, how some communities are disproportionately affected, okay? Sort of the combination of racism and poverty and trauma, and how those come to play and how those make things very difficult in these communities. The intergenerational transmission of trauma. This is really interesting, sort of the lineage of trauma with communities and how they kind of transfer from generation to generation, whether we're talking about slavery or the Holocaust or other types of trauma that impact communities. And so the idea from Trauma Transform, this TIS training, is to try to provide a systemic preventative approach. Okay, so building a trauma-informed healing system of care. We're actually going to do a little bit of activity around this sort of at the end as we go through the training. But if you can imagine a house, okay? What do we need? What are the elements of when we're trying to build up a system? What are the elements that we need, okay? First of all, the foundation. A foundation of an understanding of trauma and cultural humility and responsiveness, right? Without those elements of a foundation, it's really going to be hard to build a trauma-informed system. And then we have the structure, sort of the walls of the house, the walls and the roof and everything, the safety and stability. How do we promote compassion and dependability, collaboration, and resilience, okay? Now, the next thing I'm going to show you is the furniture, and that is so often what organizations start with. And these are this is the trauma-informed care, the interventions, right? We're going to teach everybody in our organization trauma-focused CBT, or we're going to teach everybody a certain way to work with clients who have experienced trauma. We're going to make sure all our therapists are highly trained around this. But a lot of times what happens is we start off with that furniture, but we don't have the foundation and we don't have the structure. And I think we're getting better and better at recognizing that. There's an effort in San Mateo County to work with all the school districts to make schools more trauma-informed. I think the whole restorative justice movement is a part of that. And then with our agency, with Behavioral Health and Recovery Services, with Human Services Agency, there's an effort we're trying to become, we work with a lot of clients who have experienced trauma, and the idea that it doesn't impact us as providers and it doesn't impact the organizational systems is a real fallacy. And so we're trying to get better at that. Does this resonate with people? Okay, so we start here with the client, and a lot of times we're really focused on sort of the client-centered interventions, but it really ripples up to the staff, the administration, the organization. And so again, how systems are impacted by trauma, how communities are impacted by trauma, and individuals. And these are some of the kind of, if you were to take a clinical approach, these are kind of the symptoms of a disorganized, traumatized system, right? There's not enough time for collaboration or supervision. The paperwork demands, right? Not an understanding of how increasing paperwork demands actually impacts our own ability to hold everything we're doing with the clients and our vicarious traumatization. The client needs versus the trauma-inducing policies, right? So, what kinds of policies are in your agency? Sometimes we have these traditional policies that can be a little bit punitive and a little bit traditional. I think the criminal justice system, I still think, is sort of in that camp, right? But even in our own agencies, a lot of times we're trying to manage the behavior of employees and in an effort to try to improve performance, but it ends up being counterproductive because they're not trauma-informed. The technology demands, the inadequate time for case consultation, feeling unsafe with clients. You had the term engagement earlier on in the slides, and engagement is the number one most important thing in therapy. But if you're not present, and if you're not feeling safe, and you are burnt out, or you're stressed out yourself, it's going to be really hard to engage with that client, and therefore it's going to be hard to have any kind of success, achieve any kind of success. Staff turnover, we're seeing this all over, and then traumatic organizational events, violence, suicide, deaths, how they impact the community, either with a client or a staff member. We deal with this in Children and Family Services from time to time, and it's really sad when a child dies or something terrible happens. The whole system, everyone who's touched that family, but even people who work with the employees who touch that family, everyone's impacted. And so it's important to acknowledge that and try to develop a culture that can really respond to that in a most effective way. Okay. So in just a minute, I'm going to actually ask you to break out in your tables and have a conversation about this. But I actually have this in my office. And this is a reminder to me from my unit and my team as as a supervisor, we look at the kind of the symptoms or the characteristics of a trauma organized system. It's very reactive. It's, people are reliving and retelling things. There's a lot of avoidance. It's very fragmented, right? I work in a big bureaucracy, and sometimes you can see that, right? Where the person is, 6 levels away from you, and it's hard to kind of make that personal connection. The us versus them mentality, sort of employees versus management, or even sort of line staff versus supervisors, right? Because what happens is when we become stressed out, when we become traumatized ourselves, we're more likely to retreat into our own ways of thinking and aren't open to other ways. And then, of course, authoritarian leadership, right? And we see this all the time. It's like people wanting to remind you about who is in charge. Okay. So what we're trying to do is create a more trauma-informed healing organization. Kind of that middle section is sort of the goals of TIS. And then if you look on the right side, this is kind of what we're striving for. An organization that's reflective, that can make meaning out of the past, that's growth and prevention oriented, where people can feel safe to make mistakes and grow from that, rather than trying to hide their mistakes because they don't want to get in trouble because they don't feel safe, right? It being collaborative, there being equity and accountability amongst all levels of the system, and relational leadership. So it not mattering, what level the leadership is on, they can still make an effort to have relationships with their staff and their employees. Okay, so for kind of the first group discussion today, what we'd like to do is to have you reflect on your organization and think about the components of your system that are more trauma reducing, that are there, that you feel like are doing a good job on this right column. And then also think about those things that could be trauma inducing. So parts about your system that you think are working and parts about your system that you think maybe could be changed. So should we spend like 10 minutes or so talking about that? Okay, let's continue. Would anybody like to share a couple of things that stood out about their conversation at their table? Some common themes or some things that you all talked about? Yeah.
One thing that was coming up at our table was how resource scarcity, especially working in community organizations and schools, resource scarcity when you're in that place, perceived or real, it's really hard not to be reactive, and that the most valuable resource is time. All those healing organization things are reflection, accountability, relational leadership require time. And when you have a scarcity of time, you might be able to move in some ways towards trauma-informed, towards healing. You might have some aspects of that. You're not going to get away from trauma-organized until you're structured in a way that allows people to have the time they need to do the healing.
Right. How do you find the space and the time to actually take care of yourself when you're in a classroom and you're back all day, and or the principal has stacks of things to do and they just don't have time to do it.
To build relationships with your colleagues if you don't see each other.
Right. Right. Yeah, exactly. Good. Anybody else? Think over it. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So I'm at First Five, and we're relatively small. We have 9 staff members, so we all get to know each other pretty well. But even so, like the thing that's still really apparent, so we're more trauma-informed and go into more of the healing, right? We have a couple of toes in the healing side, which is really great. But even so, there's still this sort of us versus them thing when it comes to the program staff versus the fiscal staff. Because the fiscal staff, like they have to keep us accountable and okay with the auditors, right? The grantees have to submit stuff or we don't get dinged. And, we're out here doing this touchy-feely stuff. I'm like, oh, trauma, this is all done. And they're like, actually, it doesn't add up.
It doesn't fit on the spreadsheet.
Yeah. And other nonprofits have been in, there's been that divide too. Like just the fiscal staff, wherever I work, have like this compartmentalized way of doing it, whereas the program staff or staff out in the community think about things differently. And I don't know how really to bridge that.
Yeah, it's very common. I mean, I think in agencies you have specializations. And so you have the people doing the work directly with the clients, and then you have fiscal, and you have training staff, and you have this and that. And a lot of times what I've seen is exactly that experience where the specialists are sort of removed a little bit from the kind of the work of the agency. Sort of, from the workers who are fulfilling the mission of the agency, which is to help people in some fundamental way. And so how do you make a culture so that everybody feels like they're going towards the same goal? And that fiscal people can make sure that budgets are balanced and that people are sort of accountable for their spending, but still kind of connected to that mission. It's a hard question to answer. Yeah. Thank you. I think over here we were talking about sort of, a lot of that, let's see, if we go back to the, where's the house? There we go. A lot of this furniture stuff and even some structure, but in one case over here talking about a school where, you have a whole group of wellness counselors, but they don't necessarily have a lot of experience with cultural humility and working with how to approach families and children from different cultures, right? And so there's a foundational cultural piece here, right? It's great to have wellness staff because they're there to support the students and the families, and that ultimately supports the teachers who can do their job so that they don't also have to be therapists in the classroom and things like that. So that's great, but there's a foundational piece that maybe could be. And then we also talked about safety and how when staff are asked to change, when a program, they've decided that one program is going to be removed and another one's going to bring in, and we're going to bring this evidence-based thing, people are less likely to change when they don't feel safe. It's sort of like, I was thinking about that, kind of like the secure attachment with a parent, where if you want a kid to go out and explore and take risks and chances, they need to have a really solid home base with their caregiver. And same thing with when staff feel like, they don't feel safe, there's not that foundational safety, they're going to be much less enthusiastic and more reluctant about things that we're asking them to do. And then if you have the us and them thing, then sort of leadership will say, oh, well, that's they're being resistant, you know? And then we do that with our clients too. They're being resistant because they're not engaging with us, right? And sometimes that can come because we are not taking care of ourselves. So, any other comments? Okay. And again, I think that, you know, I'm not here trying to say that, oh, you know, your organizations are so messed up because they're not trauma informed. The reason why this trauma transformed effort started was because everybody's like this to an extent. You know, it happens, and so we're not trying to judge. Jen Leland, who's the kind of the director of this whole organization, she works in the East Bay Center for Children, and she comes into leaders and really tries to minimize that defensiveness and say, look, I've seen it all. I've gone to organizations here, and everyone's on a different kind of a point in the continuum, but big organizations are hard to manage, and trauma creeps into every organization. But I think if the first step is awareness. So that's what we're trying to do. Okay, so many of you have probably seen this, but one of the basic tenets of trauma-informed care is to shift the perspective to not what is wrong with you, right? And that happens a lot. You know, why is that child doing this? You know, what is wrong with this kid? And it goes both ways too. Like, why is my boss doing this? Right? I think sometimes we can learn to be more trauma informed and have more empathy for people who are making decisions of power too. Right? So it goes both ways. But we want to shift to what has happened to you. Because if we're able to ask ourselves that question, and they make it clear in the training that this isn't something you ask out loud necessarily. This is the way that you're, the way you're thinking about your interaction. Is this generates obviously more empathy, and it puts you in more of a stance of curiosity rather than of judgment. Okay, so it provides context, and it fosters compassion, and it helps us see strengths in the face of adversity. Okay? And so hopefully we can also do that with our organizations. Instead of, what is wrong with our organization? Why are we being asked to do all this stuff that we don't want to do? Maybe we can adapt that, well, what has happened to our organization? You know? Maybe that traumatic thing that happened in children and family services has really impacted the last few years, the decisions of policies that have been made, because it was traumatic for everybody, right? So it's less blame and having more of an understanding so we can change. Okay, so these are the components of the trauma-informed systems training. One thing that you can think about today is that if you haven't been trained in trauma-transformed and trauma-informed systems, and you want to get in touch with me after the training about your organization or about how to bring it to your organization, please let me know. These are sort of the basic tenets of the training. So understanding trauma and stress, including the neurobiology and development, cultural humility and responsiveness, safety and stability, compassion and dependability, collaboration and empowerment, resilience and recovery. For the sake of today, we're really going to focus on a little bit on the understanding trauma and stress, and a little bit on the cultural humility and responsiveness. I'm trying to provide a few examples of the overall training, but in a way that will foster this kind of continue on this conversation. Okay, so what is trauma? A lot of times we sort of think of the event as being trauma, but it's really, the event is a big part of it, but it's the perception of the event that really makes it traumatic, right? Something traumatic for you might not be traumatic for me, okay? So, The event is an actual or extreme threat of harm. And again, this is trying to really make sure that we go back to the building block of what is trauma so that we're all speaking the same language. We have the experience of the fight, flight, or freeze, and being helpless to escape, okay? And again, the fight, flight, or freeze, like we'll talk about neurobiologically, is really our primordial sort of brainstem, right? It's the things that keep us alive. And so we have that, our brain reacts like that to an event in order to help us survive that event. It overwhelms the brain and the body, okay? And the effect is disintegration and dysregulation. I think we really know what dysregulation is, right? When someone seemingly can't control their emotions, or they become very escalated, or they become very withdrawn. But the disintegration is really about how, when you are integrated, right? You've got your frontal cortex, which is your thinking brain, and you've got your limbic system, and you've got your brain stem, right? And everything's kind of working together. What happens when a traumatic event happens, or you're reminded of a traumatic event or triggered, is our bodies become disintegrated. Does everyone remember, has anyone heard of Daniel Siegel? And so he has this way of like sort of the basics of looking at the brain, where you have the brain stem, which is the kind of our heart rate and our blood flow and everything. And then you have the limbic system, which stores our emotional memories. And you've got the amygdala within the limbic system that it's our sort of alarm system. Something's wrong, right? And then you've got your frontal cortex, right? And that part of the brain is problem solving, thinking ahead, sort of a more cognitive oriented part of the brain. But when trauma happens, your amygdala says something's wrong, I am in danger, everything goes offline. And you no longer have access to your frontal cortex, right? Because your emotion, the survival part of your brain is telling you that you're in danger, okay? And so what happens is that people with chronic trauma or a lot of trauma or untreated trauma, it can have lasting adverse effects. And we see it in the classrooms, and we see them in organizations, right? Where people are just highly stressed, and they're prone to being easily triggered and dysfunctional. So part of, is anyone familiar with the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems? Have people been exposed to that? So just real quick, we have kind of two parts of that, which is the accelerator part. So the sympathetic nervous system, that really accelerates our body so we can survive, right? If a tiger were to run in this room, I guarantee you your sympathetic nervous system would kick in, right? Because right now, hopefully, your parasympathetic is you're balanced. Your parasympathetic is really there, right? You have a slow heart rate, you're relaxed. Maybe you're thinking, hopefully you're paying attention to the training. You might be thinking about what you're doing tonight after, whatever. A tiger comes in, you're not thinking about that. You're not thinking about you're having lunch. You're not thinking about, right? Because what it does is that your body is trained to survive. If it wasn't like that, then, early humans would not have survived, right? So what happens? Our pupils dilate, our bronchi relaxes, our heart rate accelerates, right? And our appetite is also suppressed, okay? And so all of a sudden, it's just about, what do I do? Do I flee? Do I fight? Do I freeze, right? How do I survive? And it's an instinctual reaction, okay? And then after the traumatic event is over and you know that you are safe, eventually your parasympathetic nervous system is going to kick in. Your heart rate's going to slow back down. You're going to get your appetite back. Your vessels are going to dilate again, okay? And so, if you can think of sort of a person who hasn't experienced a lot of trauma, there's your sympathetic nervous system kicks in when it needs to, and then your parasympathetic balances it out. When you think about a child who has experienced a lot of early childhood trauma, someone who's been exposed to domestic violence, or someone who's been exposed to some kind of abuse or neglect, what happens is their sympathetic nervous system is chronically being activated. And so you think about the cortisol, the stress hormones that are constantly being released into your system. And you can imagine that there's a real imbalance of that kind of experience. And so what happens is, and then because one of the interesting things about children is that when they're in the home or when they're in an experience, they don't have it, a lot of times they don't have any control, right? And so what do? They can't fight, they can't flee, and so what do? They dissociate. It's a protective mechanism to kind of go inward and not pay attention to reality, because it's a protective mechanism, right? So we see a lot of combination of kids being very escalated and then also really withdrawing and dissociating. Because they're reminded of what happened. But you can sort of understand why the health issues pop up as a result of trauma. When your immune system is constantly being suppressed and compromised, when your appetite's being suppressed, when your heart rate's constantly on high, right? You can understand kind of, these sort of the future predictions of heart disease and diabetes and things like that. Okay, so again, this is even kind of a more simple version of this, but you have your thinking brain, the prefrontal cortex, and the survival emotional brain, the limbic system. And really, the survival and the emotion brain, limbic system is really where those memories are stored. And it's not just, it's really body memories more than it is cognitive memories, right? And so when a kid has experienced something traumatic and an adult, whether it's an after-school program or whether it's a classroom, when they raise their voice, that reminds them of the thing that happened to them. That's stored in the survival emotional brain, and then they go offline, and then their bodies are reacting as if they're trying to survive something, okay? And so that's kind of what we're looking at. So I actually love this analogy because, to use with kids and also to use with ourselves. If you can think of the thinking brain as a rider on a horse, okay? So the rider is controlling the horse. You're the thinking brain. Okay, we're going to go over here. We're going to go over there. We're going to trot. We're going to gallop. We're going to stop. We're going to go over here, right? I'm controlling my horse. I'm the thinking brain. The survival brain is the horse. It's got the protective instincts, right? So you're riding along and all of a sudden something scary happens to the horse, and the horse like wheels up, and I'm not a horse rider, so I'm not using any of the right vocabulary, obviously. But you can kind of get the analogy. And so when we're triggered, the rider falls off the horse. Now we don't have any control of the horse. The emotional survival brain is running around. This is kind of a nice thing to use with kids. It's kind of normalizing and sort of easy to understand. Oh, look at that. See, there he goes. It's all right. So this is one of the things they teach in Trauma Transformed is, again, the aggravating behavior is cause for a pause. So something's happening. Someone's off their horse that you see, and it's really easy for us to react to that, but instead to try to pause, take a breath, and ask ourselves, well, again, what has happened to you? What is happening here? What is the need behind this behavior? And how can I respond to this need? Does this make sense to everybody? Okay. And so what happens is, and I love, I kind of love this part of the training because I think it's so simple, but it's so true, is that when we interact with someone else, we're always finding our commonalities. We're creating a shared culture, right? You and I, we may have a very different upbringing. in terms of what our life experience has been. But when you and I are both calm and our thinking brain is working and we're relaxed, you and I can find something to relate to and something to bond over, right? It might be our job, it might be something you did over the weekend, it might be our families, right? But what happens is when we get stressed out, we retreat to our cultural centers, right? Now, all of a sudden, when I'm scared, and I think this is happening nationally, to be honest, when I'm scared, I can't think about your well-being. I don't care. I'm thinking about mine. I'm trying to survive, right? And so when you're chronically in this stressed out system, and this is where the us-them thing happens. And it's hard to take that other person's perspective because you're not in that space. When you're stressed, your rider's off the horse, your thinking brain's not activated. Your body is trying to help you, is trying to help you survive. It's very stressed out, right? And so one of the foundations of empathy is really taking care of ourselves. And I was thinking about this the other day. It's a little bit unfair. Because I think our kids, especially, using the school example again, there's so much going on for kids. There's so much more anxiety with kids. I have 2 daughters, 10 and 13, and it's coming at you from all sides. Social media and, the parents working and the stuff going on nationally and this feeling like sort of we're doomed, right? The level of anxiety is so much higher. And so then you're a teacher in a classroom and you're having 30 kids come in and they're all super anxious, and yet you have to manage all that and hold all that, right? And it's just unfair. But the reality is we have a responsibility to ourselves to be able to tolerate that and to be able to stay here so that we can create a culture of calmness in our class and create a culture of being able to interact with each other and be able to have empathy for each other. But it's very difficult, and some of that is involved in the system itself that can either support us or make things more traumatic. Yeah. Any questions? Comments? Experiences? Okay. All right. So cultural humility, the part of trauma-informed system that's more cultural humility, it's a process of communal reflection to analyze the root causes of suffering, creating a broader, more inclusive view of the world, okay? A lifelong learning and critical self-reflection. You remember when this stuff was called cultural competence? I'm culturally competent, I have the skills to be culturally competent, right? And it was sort of like, well, you either are or you aren't. But really, love this approach so much more, where it's really about cultural humility. It's about starting with yourself and understanding where you come from, what your values are. Being able to stay in that stance of curiosity about what your cultural experience is like, what your values are like, how you were raised. Things like that. It's also keeping in mind one's position of power and privilege, right? Being a white male, trying to be cognizant of that. Being a therapist in a room, I have a position of power over that, right? Being with one of my supervisees, there's a power and privilege over that. And so acknowledging that power and privilege and whatever your status is in the room. Dr. Ken Hardy, who does I would highly recommend looking him up. He does a lot of sort of cultural humility trainings. And then he talks about it's really the responsibility of the person who has the power and the privilege in that interaction to sort of acknowledge it and make adaptations in order to create that shared culture. Because when we don't, we're still here. And a lot of times our clients are so compliant. They're nodding their head and they're saying yes, yes. You're working with a mom, right? But if you haven't sort of acknowledged that and really created a foundation of safety and tried to make that interaction more equal, it stays here, and we don't realize it. They say, oh, they signed the paperwork, they were in agreement with everything we want to do, we're going to start family work, and we're going to start individual therapy, and we have a plan for the kid because we know it's for their own well-being, right? We're good, we have a great relationship. But we haven't done the work, we haven't done that acknowledgement. And so that's a big part of this. The other thing is understanding sort of how communities are impacted. And again, it's changing our perspective for what's wrong with that community. Why is there so much violence in that community? Why is there so much poverty in that community? Rather looking at what's happened to that community, right? And so race plus place equals health is sort of a very basic kind of formula to look at. These are the factors that are impacting our communities. If you look at the difference, the life expectancy difference, were you the one who was telling me, Carla, about between EPA, East Palo Alto, and Palo Alto? The freeway running through, right? Race plus place equals health. And I think, what was the life expectancy difference?
It's like 13 to 16 years difference in life expectancy.
Right.
Depending on which side of the freeway.
Right. When I took this training, it was in Oakland. It was MacArthur in Oakland, and it was separating different parts of Oakland, and it was the same kind of thing. So certain communities had more resources, more accessibility. They were whiter, shocker, right? And so the communities that are really impacted by racism, by microaggressions, by sort of kind of an undervalued, their society, a lack of stores, a lack of business opportunity. So race and place, really does equal health. So insidious trauma is really like, they kind of define it as sort of acid falling on a stone. So it's sort of like those microaggressions that happen. That, in some ways, some people don't even like the word microaggressions because it's sort of from the person of privilege. Oh, it's a micro thing. It's a really little thing. But to that person, it feels like a bigger thing, right? And they get this, people get this all the time. In schools, a person of color, females, you're sort of getting this thing all the time. So it's kind of this insidious sort of cumulative trauma, the historical trauma. You heard of a post-traumatic slave, is it disorder? But it's Dr. Joy DeGruy from Portland University talking about the lineage of slavery, the trauma of slavery, and how it impacts generation after generation. They've done similar things about the Holocaust and things like that, okay? We'll probably see things about immigration. Is a similar thing. So historical trauma on communities and how that impacts. Institutional racism, right? We can't understand why this parent isn't signing off on the mental health services that we think is important for them within the school. And we see this a lot where parents just don't trust the system. And then we tend to jump to they're being neglectful or they're not meeting the needs of their kids. And so we start to develop that, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you doing this for your kid? Your kid has been hospitalized twice in the past year, and they clearly need services. Why won't you let us provide that to them, right? And again, it's that mistrust of the institutions. And so if we don't acknowledge that, with the parent, it's going to be harder to get. And then all those things can lead to community violence. So here's a lot of context of kind of what they call synergistic trauma. And we're going to break out and do another discussion in a few minutes. But oppression, racism, homophobia, sexism, classism, inequities, xenophobia, right? So this is kind of like, in addition to the individual traumas that people are experiencing, they have these societal sort of oppressive traumas. And they call it this kind of synergistic trauma. Okay, so we're going to break again into small groups. How how does synergistic trauma impact your clients? So you can either think about in general, you can think about a case, a kid or an adult who comes from a certain kind of community. What are some ways this affects your clients' perceptions of your agency organization? We don't ask this a lot. I think, I working for HSA, and my classification was psychiatric social worker. The worst job title ever, right? It's like the most stigmatic. First of all, everyone's meds, right? And you're like, no, I can't prescribe meds. But also, it's just such a, it comes from the psychiatric hospitals, right? And it's just sort of this old vestige. And so I would always call myself a counselor. And that seemed to be a lot more, but on my business card has my job title, but it also has the HSA logo on it. And so this is the agency that takes kids away from families. That's how people view it. And so, again, I had to be aware of what the client's perceptions were of me and take a lot of time to educate them about the different kinds of social work and what kind of social work I was doing, right? And then how can your understanding of some of these trauma transform concepts help to shift your interactions with your clients? I know this is kind of a lot to tackle, but let's break up into groups and have some discussion. One of the things that reminded me over here, you were talking about MTSS and these meetings. One of the things, like we have these CFTs in child welfare, and it can be very intimidating for a client to come in and have all these service providers. You've got your social worker and their supervisor and the BHRS therapist and their supervisor and their teacher and just sort of all these people. One of the things we're trying to do is have the client have more input in terms of who comes. So who is support to them? It could be a neighbor, an aunt, or uncle, and does the supervisor really need to be in that meeting that's never actually met the client? Things like that. But I was thinking about IEPs, and thinking about this synergistic trauma and this sort of coming in already not with the institutional racism that they've experienced and not trusting just this experience of coming in and having the school psychologist and the teacher and the principal and the aide and whoever else, the occupational therapist, and just everyone, and everyone's going around talking about, and you try to be strength-based, but really what you hear is what's wrong with my kid, and and sort of, how can we transform these experiences for people to acknowledge this experience of synergistic trauma so that they're more, they have more trust in the system and they can be more collaborative, and we can be more collaborative with them. So that's what I was thinking about. Anybody else want to comments about what you talked about at your table or questions? Yeah.
I think maybe one of the takeaways I have from our discussion is how sometimes when an organization is good at either providing access in one area, right, like in language. My school's a bilingual school. We're really good at providing access for Spanish-speaking parents in terms of understanding what's going on, being able to communicate with their teacher, all of that. But sometimes if you're good at addressing one aspect of the synergistic trauma, then you think, we've succeeded in all the others, and even the client might think that you've succeeded in the others because they're so grateful to have a piece of access that they're not used to experiencing in general.
Right, I speak Spanish, things are good.
Yeah, our parent understands what we're telling
I
them, but we haven't addressed, class or their, lack of educational privilege as a barrier to feeling empowered in a conversation about their child and the services their child needs.
Yes.
And so the synergistic before the trauma is really key because it's not one singular trauma, it's the whole, it's all of it.
That's right. And then if I'm sitting down with a kid or a parent for their intake, and I launch into family history and history of trauma and all that stuff, and I haven't even been able to develop that relationship, And I used to do that, it's like that's what I need to do. I need to get the parents to sign the paperwork so I can see the child, but I also need to get a history so I know kind of what we're dealing with. But I look back and I go, oh my goodness, I didn't take the time. Why do we have to do that the first session? Why can't, and then when I'm asking questions about where they're from as a governmental employee, I've got to be, especially these days, right? I really need to help establish a sense of safety and really help them understand what my role is, so that they can feel comfortable enough starting to share, and we can start to have that relationship. So you're right. Our staff speaks Spanish. We'll be good. Yeah, but that clinician's from Mexico and I'm from El Salvador. They don't. They don't, or they're from Mexico City and I'm from a Puebla, it's sort of this, there's a lot of different ways to have curiosity to go in and talk about what your experience was like and where you grew up and, Thank you for that, yeah.
Bringing up another thing for me that sometimes when we put so much work into writing one aspect of it, like language, which is huge, then when there's something else, we're like, why wasn't that good enough? Why are they always demanding more? Like, we've already made this huge effort to provide language access, and I think it can create that us and them dynamic even further because we've made an effort.
Right. And sometimes we need to ask ourselves, is this not meeting my needs, right? I want to provide an intervention, or I want to reach out and make an effort, and then I want that to be acknowledged or appreciated by the client. You're like, oh, and so we fall into this way of thinking, oh, they're always the victim. They're always needing more, right? And again, there's probably reasons for that. And sort of the what happened to you kind of perspective, rather than why aren't you more grateful for your services? This is free. I'm out here working really hard to try to make things better for you, and so I'm retreating into my stress and my wanting. What are my needs? I want to be valued. I want to feel like I'm doing a good job. And then I realize, oh, that's what that's about. It's not about really taking this client's perspective. Yeah.
Just that little back and forth made me think one of the us and them dynamics that can come up is that as family engagement professionals, our client is the family, and many of our colleagues, their client is the student.
Right. Yeah.
Just even like saying that out loud. Whoa.
Yeah. Yeah. We have the same thing with sometimes with BHRS and CFS. We are focused on the child and the child safety. And a lot of times BHRS is working with the parent. And there's in us and them, there's this perspective of like, we're concerned about the way the child is being treated, and they're concerned about the way that we are sort of not understanding the parent, where the parent's coming from. So yeah, that happens. Who is our client? And they're different members of the family, and then we silo ourselves and it becomes an us-them.
I think one of the thinking about like trauma in an organization or in a system, it's going to shift my interactions with clients in the sense of like I've already been aware of what trauma the individual might hold,
Right.
but looking at how like, oh, I take the time to like talk to my principal for 3 minutes, half an hour before we have our meeting, so that she is calm enough to eat her lunch, so that she goes into that meeting with a full belly, like how that's going to serve my clients, and thinking about my interactions with my colleagues and healing our collective and systemic and organizational trauma as something that's going to serve our clients.
So you're trying to maintain your shared culture with your client, but then you're going, deal with it.
I'm going, go away.
Yeah.
My collaborators.
Right. Right. Yeah, there was, I worked with a teacher one time who was, just, I would say, for lack of a better word, old school. And so raising her voice and being very, like, trying to control the classroom was a very big, it was just a big part of her thing. And it was so hard for me because I felt like this was my client and I'm protecting my client. And so I tried so hard to not, to have our interactions with her continue to be positive, try to explain to her sort of the idea of kids being triggered and how this kid's experience growing up, how that translates to them being triggered in the classroom when someone raises their voice, and really how she could actually make her job easier by having this kid pay more attention and be more sort of present by adjusting the way that she, kind of from the classroom. And it was hard because the visceral part of me is like, what the hell are you doing? Like, clearly these kids are not responding to this, and you can, and that was the sort of, but I know that's not going to get anywhere, and so maybe I can't really interact with her when I'm in that space, and I need to like, okay, tomorrow 9:30 after I've had my coffee at recess, we'll have a casual conversation about this, because if I do it right now, it's not going to it's not going to go well. So. Yeah, thinking about the system, and and your client, and and advocating, but also having empathy for the person who's, the teacher or the administrator who might not be seeing things the way you do. How do you do all that? Yoga is the answer, by the way. I'm just kidding. No. No. There's this funny thing about, I heard a teacher the other day complain about how, they're pushing yoga in our schools and our kids are so not into it. So there is this thing about like, oh yeah, yoga's great. I mean, it really is. It promotes mindfulness and everything. And 2 minutes. 2 minutes left? Thank you. Okay. See how I got all elevated? My sympathetic nervous system just kicked in. Okay. Okay, so part of the trauma-informed systems training is also coming away with a commitment to change. So the discussions we just had, if we were doing this training, you would write down a real commitment to something that you would do, a tangible thing that you would do, and then you would pair up with a partner and you would hold each other accountable. And you'd call each other in a few months and say, how are you doing with that thing that you promised to do, right? And so that's part of it, is making changes, not just sort of talking about this. It's all very interesting stuff, and going back and doing what we always do. That's part of it. I love this. I was telling our table about this slide. This is perfect, right? That's kind of what happens, right? It's like, and again, we're less likely to change if we don't feel safe. Or if we don't feel, and a lot of times leadership's like, oh yeah, I believe in trauma-informed. You guys do that. Go ahead. You guys become trauma-informed, but I'm not going to adjust any of the things that I do or anything that happens on the high levels of the organization. We can kind of skip this, but this is sort of about how leaderships can make change, belief, mindset, behaviors, sort of the cultural, practice. I actually love this cultural piece because it's sort of like we're also kind of siloed, and it's like I'm emailing someone 5 times a day and I've never even met them in person, A lot of times I tell my staff is like, they're having a disagreement with a BHRS therapist. He's like, go have coffee with them just once. Just get to know them a little bit. It's when you have a relationship with somebody, it helps so much, but we're so, we're so kind of divided in that way. This is something that you can think about, but this is an activity that we were going to do, and maybe you can think about this, but and I think we've talked a lot about this, but the furniture, structure, and foundation, what are some ideas you have to kind of add to that or advocate in your organization? And again, this is sort of the ultimate goal of trauma-informed communities. A trauma-informed system understands how chronic stress and trauma affects human beings and creates safe and supportive care environments that foster strength and resiliency so that everyone in the system can develop, grow, and thrive. Any questions? I know we're sort of a little bit over, but thank you all. That was great. Great discussions. Thank you. That was great.